Establishing the tonality was just the premise of a prelude, a toccata. Touching, toccare, different types of touches, articulations, expressive rhetoric, meaningful and convincing speech, capacity to delay the meaningful notes, to prepare the leaps, to organize the hierarchy of the tonic, subdominant, dominant, and tonic, in this case E minor toccata by Bach, finishing with a Picardy third for acoustical reasons more than for optimistic compared to pessimistic moods. Since it's not mood music, it's pure music that has an expression, but that expression is not the piece. The piece exists as such, establishing tensions and releases through harmonic and melodic line, as well as tensions because of the intervals and the leaps of the tritones or the sixth or the octaves. To start with the pattern of the descending diatonic scale or chromatic, the lament of the cacciatura going up and the appoggiatura going down. These effects are therefore the quality of the expression of the lament, of the sorrow. And inevitably, when we play Baroque, we have to make sure that we separate the decoration from the real notes. In this case, we have to think the descent of the steps and then semi-steps, or chromatically by semi-steps. By articulation in different levels of expression for each note. So if we want to convey the listener's attention, then we play softer the other ornamental, decorative and passing tone or neighboring tone or anticipation or appoggiatura, cacciatura, almost as if you could hold it by the finger to si, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, si, la, sol, do, si, la, sol, fa, this grande ligne arching over the line of the horizon, almost like a rainbow over the music, full of beautiful expressions in the details with these neighboring tones. And then starting never on the downbeat. Imagine for 1 second that Bach would organize his harmonic rhythm with the melodic rhythm and would be downbeatish, heavy and it's always 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. That you have to sort of start a little bit withheld in the tempo with a nano rubato and then forward with a nano rubato too. But this time start with an eighth note rest. There is nothing before except the silence before Bach's music. Obviously, if you start the first note, you think it's a downbeat, unless you know the score. But the fact of the performer is to suggest hints, not pedantically, but just enough to suggest that the accent or the tenuto will be on the beat. So giving this more meaning to the D sharp leading tone, accacciaturish. Establishing the rhythmic pattern, the melodic pattern, and the harmonic pattern. And the harmonic pattern is to have first an ostinato, a mi stinato. Bach is an organist, Bach thinks as an organist, Bach acts as an organist in that sense, polyphonically, but also keyboardly, not only polyphonically in terms of only contrapuntal voice leading. And so very often on his organ prelude and fugues, great meditations over a given pedal of F. Organ preludes, or the C minor. Still holding in the foot organ pedal. Always these melodic lines by design, in the sense that well, there is a Russian musicologist, Yavorsky, that's the name I wanted to say, who came up with his own theory of Bach's symbolic gestures in terms of leaps, rhetoric intervals, which bring us to the religious, sacred Bach music writing, as well as used by Bach in his secular music, like the this toccata. He speaks about the leap of the diminished fourth, or the cross, as a symbolic design in the interval, or the love, when you have the leap of the minor sixth over the fifth, and the descent with lament by the appoggiaturas, 2 by 2, etc. So we can put in one bag and say, okay, there's a toolbox of stuff that Bach used, but that would be reductive, because the spiritual connection to them is more in Bach's way of delaying the effects, of presenting the situation. In this case, it's a harpsichord toccata, the E minor one, unlike the organ one. He cannot hold forever the E and do. Over that, because it's not good. But not that it's not right, it's just that it's cheesy. But factually, I would like to say that when you play the pattern, repetitively as he does in the harpsichord toccata, he's sort of reminiscing us that this is my ostinato. But he uses the head of the melodic subject of the thematic material of this motif. So the ascension of the two elements of the accompaniment, when it goes away from the ostinato to the subdominant, the tonic, the dominant and the tonic, and it sort of dialogues and interlaces with the pattern of the thematic material of this leitmotif. So what you do on the piano is have a different color for the repetitive pattern of the basso and the melody. Of course, didactically, Bach was such a good pedagogue that he wrote down all the notes which in the past Baroque harpsichordists like Louis Couperin would just write whole notes and you just improvise yourself, so that the decoration is not as essential as the real notes that define the skeleton. And so it could have been just one note difference. Or perhaps and the point is not to play anything that comes to mind, because then we would have no more the urtext Bach own will. But Bach taught for improvisation, inventions to be creative from the given pattern of the harmonic structure of the basso, which would be continuo in most of the cases, the moving bass and harmonized, and therefore he would praise the creativity. Today we have to just praise the authenticity of what we think our text is, and of course we don't want to put our students in trouble in front of juries if they start improvising their own decorations, even if they are legitimate to do in this style, perhaps not on the piano compared to the harpsichord, because it's another aesthetic. But for instance, the aesthetic of playing even is the piano. The harpsichord would be by grouping of phrases, by connected slight breathing of disconnections of the 2 and 3 and 3 and 2 notes in a row. So it's a very different concept, aesthetic of what you expect from the melodic notes. If a pianist plays, it sounds very straight. If a harpsichordist plays, and if the pianist plays uneven on the piano, as a harpsichordist would do jeu inégal, what did he drink before he played, or can he play even? Since evenness on the keyboard piano is considered the aesthetic of expectation, and the uneven jeu inégal is the one on the harpsichord. Of course, you play harpsichord music on the piano, but Bach wrote absolute music beyond the harpsichord and the piano or the organ. He just wrote leaps, octaves, semi-steps, and leaps of octave, or descending fourths on the ascending minor, with a descending pattern on the ascending mode. So every one of his gestures in terms of the, especially the descent, that perspires through all these patterns of decoration, here to make us understand it's a descent. The whole toccata is based on this descending scale that inevitably crushes us down to our human condition, and it goes into the fugue at the end of it. This kind of violin writing with the 7/6 suspensions in appoggiaturas, but also the descending scale and chromatic and diatonic. With this entrance of the second voice. If I voice and hold and become so unelegant because I over want to suggest that there is this line that has to sort of appear, I think it should be done more subtly, only with an articulation change of touch. Within the articulation a little more heavy. It helps to sing it as I tried earlier and voice it so that you can hear. Of course, when you practice a fugue, it's even more complicated because you have to know it in order to play it in the industry of performing on two hands vertical. But in terms of understanding it and therefore having it in your brain and your soul, of course, outside of the muscular memory, you have to write it in several parts and then start playing one, sing another, and play the third, even eventually crossed. And then you go fa mi fa re mi do re si fa si la sa la so la do fa do la do fa do so fa so mi sa mi so mi so mi fa mi re mi do mi re mi re. In fact, it's more easy to do when you sing in less leap broken six, like in violin parting. In the first fugato, which is after the initial toccata demonstration of E minor, as I said in the beginning. So when you start the fugato, you can sing. But I think it's good to sing innerly that when you perform it, so that the hypertones, if I may say, the main line notes flow over above the decorations of the 8th note to 16th note, but you isolate in your inner hearing, your inner ear. Of course, it helps helps to practice it by doing si, la, sol, la. If you cannot sing it and you're shy of solfeging, you can go la, 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 la. So it doesn't have to be so much sung, it has to be said, spoken, chewed almost. And then when another voice plays, you can also invert. Or with the solfege, si, do, si, la, si, mi, re, do, si, do, fa, fa, si, mi. And then when the fourth or third voice or whatever next voice enters, you can start thinking one, singing another, or playing both. And corresponding with perhaps crossing as if you want to understand the piece by itself, in its integrity of non-upside down or downside up, non-accompaniment with melodies, just each voice has its own meaning, and especially continuation when the new theme subject comes to the next entrance, you still follow the first. I recall my teacher being on her deathbed, half comatose in the last months of her life, very long life, in her 90s, way into her 90s, telling me that during the few minutes she had of mental presence before to sink in eternal sleep, she said that she was telling herself, voice by voice, a fugue from the well-tempered clavier in her bed, where she was completely almost, so to say, paralyzed. So she didn't connect it to play, just the singing of the solfege notes or hinting it. And I recall such touching moments where I was next to her, visiting her at that very late stage of her illness, which wasn't really an illness, was just age, old age, just wearing down the engine. But the brain was so especially, and the heart so, in sense of soulful, alive. And so we would just dialogue by telling each other voices of fugues, like she would start the first one, do, re, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, la, re, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, and I would go, sol, la, si, do, or continue, do, re, do, si, la, fa, sol, fa, mi, fa, re, sol, fa, mi, re, do. And so she would go, la, si, do, re, re, do, si, sol, fa, mi, fa, mi, re, do, re, sol, do. Because when I learned them a week a day, or not a week a day, a week a prelude, not a week a day, a week a prelude and fugue, I would write them down on staffs with clefs and not played, just sung and solfeged and known, basically, before to be finger known in terms of the muscular memory. And of course when you have to play it, it has to verticalize. You have to say, okay, I'm going to find which solution. You run out of fingers, and you have to have some sliding, some superstitions, I was going to say some substitutions, and some sliding of fingers, so that you can have a clarity of articulation and at the same time a warmth of sound, yet not pedal to smear it. And you follow what you already hear by the inner ear in the follow-up of the voices, which are not the main ones. It's a continuous flux, a continuous flow of parallel voices in a hierarchy of its own that Bach decides, and not us. We follow them all. Richter used to tell me in some fugue lessons that I should smell every second rose on a garden, therefore I should choose which voice to follow and then not drop it for the next entrance, because then it becomes mono voice, so to say, if we only bring out the entrance of the subject in each entrance. All this is easy to say, difficult to do, takes long time, takes introspection, takes patience and love for the music, because it's not that because you will understand it in a medical sense that you will love it better, because of course you can sort of like work with the anatomy of it. It still remains spiritual journey because of the beauty or the suggested beauty of the melodic lines, perhaps in Jaworski's, to literal translation of the gestures and corresponding in all Bach's music, according to him, or most for the well-tempered clavier, with the religious, sacred suggestion through music of Bach's writing. People can agree or disagree. Same thing in a certain way in the synesthesia of Scriabin, who decides himself which color corresponds to which key, because that's his opinion, and perhaps it's some kind of sensorial relation to the music when he asked people to hold hands in circle when listening to his music so they can feel the music through the vibrations of their bodies. I think that's perhaps a bit far-fetched compared to Bach, inevitably, but it makes me think that music is a sensorial expression that goes into the soul and becomes something spiritual. And then of course you can explain this interval and that delay and this voice leading and this articulation and this delay and this anticipation and this rubato, but all these tools in the box don't justify the box. Each box is just the melodic and aesthetic, rhetorical conviction that Bach's music brings to us, and then we have this eloquence in the performance through the music of Bach himself. So when we play and when one could argue, why did he write a mordent for the end of the subject, and then every time after that, when another subject is answered, we don't have a little. It's because obviously, I think, it was implied. Now, did it mean because it was implied that it has to be every time there and then? Because it is either it's intuitive and you say, oh, I feel it, I need it, I don't have to question it and organize it and say every 2 times, like every second rose I'll smell in the garden, which I think is a truly good statement, because it makes you feel like you can bring yourself up to think outside of the box while you are in the box. If not, everything is beautiful, everything is meaningful, every section is intensely emotional, if not at least expressive and spiritually uplifting, but then it becomes this special suspension and this special suspension and this one too in the second compared to the seventh. Literally, personally, in too many affects of each beat being beautiful, meaningful, expressive, delaying, and it's all right. But I think hierarchy is to think about the line. That's why I like to sing it to myself when I practice. So the articulation of the 16th note will be air legato, and the quarter notes more heavy. Now perhaps it's too much in the demonstration, perhaps it could be more subtle. And ultimately, what is interesting to observe in piano playing is that the hint of the thought of it is already so much more projecting than one thinks. You don't have to demonstratively always show it up, like overly rubato, overly voiced, chorale this or that. No, it's, well, partly yes, because it becomes part of the expression of the at least artificially faked improvisatory style, because we play all the notes, so we just fake like as if they come spontaneously. In fact, they're all written, and we just play every detail because Bach wrote it down compared to Louis Couperin. But it's not an unmeasured prelude, but it has to sound like as if it's spawned under our hands. So we have to do it within his notes. And always think of drawing the main notes. So in fact it's a combination of suggestive thought process while voiced large values, and light played in air legato articulation short values, and beware when you have a suspension, therefore a delay of the decaying long value, not to play the short first that follows, which is the release, before it comes to become another tension to the next release, in order to delay the releases instead of playing on the beat. We don't think that we do, but we do unwillingly accent the exit from the long value and not observing its decay, and pick it where it dropped and then rise. Until it becomes too much hammered. And in order to maintain these voice-led phrasings, the quality of the legato, the sound quality, the roundness of the sound, perhaps with a corda, the length of the little mordent, and then the voicing quality to bring out the new voice, and follow the bass, the alto, and not accent the exit. Ahead of each beat, ahead of each phrase, a preparation for the articulation which will lead to the next, in order to create a continuum without this sense of unwilling accent, but it is becoming an accent because of the decay of the long value before the short. So the short has to be softer, crescendo to the next long. It has to be constantly thought of, because if you played it, it's too late. On the piano you cannot vibrato it back crescendo, like voice or strings or winds. And you always tell yourself how beautiful it is with the leaves. When you play Bach, that every element spawns the next, as if there is no end to it. There's no need of a climax per se, because it's a continuous developmental elements after elements. They self-generate their own expression and development and rising and tensions and releases and retentions and rising and opening and spreading and exponentially expanding and chromatically closing. It seems like it's a forever run-on sentence, because everybody is speaking a part that has a meaning to itself, and in comparison to the other, in conjunction to the other, in concurrence with the other, and sometimes in concert with the other, becomes, so to say, friendly in the sense of loving. They don't collide each other, they don't intershock the parts. Sometimes, like here, for a sense of more acute pain of the lament, the leading tone with the minor seventh are purposely put together. Most of the time the voices interlace each other like many fish in the tank. This smoothly and very softly, and sometimes very wisely, of course wisely all the time, interlaced. Every time you play it, you hear hear a different way from a different point of view, as if it's a prism that reveals itself from different lighting. That's why the polyphony is the richness of the soul for the musician, and I think that was, of course, Bach's daily hearing. For us to even rise to the level to understand it before we can play it, after we have, let's say, understood it, what it takes to invent it daily like he did, with soul and brain. And then have this moment of relaxation musically after this intensity of voice leadings before the real fugue, the more finger fugue toccata, therefore, for the touch, regardless of the tempo chosen or the articulation. The unity of descent of the whole piece is a unity of descending scale. The fugue itself is more, let's say, virtuosic. Whenever this fugue is more vocal. So different touches, legato and of course non-legato. And then the adagio in between, on lute, improvisatory and vertical. It's somewhere between recitativo and trio. Completely improvisato, but with his notes, meaning his detailed notes. Tonic, dominant, raised, relative major, G major, D major, flat 7, A minor, this dominant, subdominant. Subdominant is really undertonic fifth, not subdominant in the scale as a degree, but the subdominant is dependent fifth to the dominant on the other side of a scale, of the circles of fifths. Of the time was improvised, and the notation was the didactical, at least for Bach, in order to teach it. And the performer a student had to copy it from the teacher's book to start learning it. Therefore, the first connection to the music is the written, not the played. And then they put fingers and the articulation, like C.P. Bach in his essay speaks about fantasieren am Klavier, which means imagine on the keyboard rather than play, spielen am Klavier. So all these elements of continuous musical source material coming out of a very simple element of a descending scale in this case, in different aspects, in a toccata, a fugato, a recitativo, and then a real quick fugue, not a vocal, but an instrumental fugue at the end with a finger joy. Whenever this is voice-led joy, and this is more improvisatory joy. And the opening, just almost like as if you warm up, the audience towards the piece, so they can listen to it more attentively when the fugue arrives at the end, or at the same time establish a tonality out of the fact that most of the tonalities were established with different type of tuning in those days. So that was also had to do with the establishment of the subdominant, tonic and dominant, and all these elements have to be taken into account. Of course, on the forte piano, they didn't play so much after the harpsichord. On the modern piano, we replay a lot of the harpsichord music of Bach. And inevitably, we don't have to have a tuning situation about in which key we tune it and which type of piano we use, like the harpsichords, which are more so specifically made for given types of periods and places in Europe. But on the piano is more universal, but it shouldn't mean that it should be played so more generic, so to say. It has to be also, I think, deeply involved in terms of the subjective involvement of the performer. And of course, it's easy to say, difficult to do, because the audiences are always professionals for young people, especially when they have to go through auditions, juries, exams, competitions. And their peers who listen to them are people who, of course, are fed your text. And inevitably, any coming out of it or getting out of it is, at best, eccentric, at worst, irresponsible. And so, if the creativity is praised in interpretational improvisation as a harpsichordist, the precision and the cleanness and perhaps the evenness is praised in the piano performance of even the same piece, given the fact that we played also on the piano. And it's like as if you have two different types of expectations while you have an informed education about the performance practice of the day. So between the performance practice, the information, the knowledge, and the understanding, you have to put it in a side with leave the love and the intuition forward and hope that the mix filtered of all these facts will remain so pure that you can still express the meaning of why you play this in the first place, even you know more than perhaps you should have in the first place. Sometimes ignorance is bliss in order to keep the intuition, and sometimes knowledge becomes self cancellation. Shouldn't, I couldn't, I mustn't, it shouldn't be legato, it shouldn't be romantic, and all these kind of cliche words for Bach, which are wrong by themselves. It's just what it is. And the expression of dropping scales or leaping octaves or dropping fourths or finishing in major. Yes, it's only what it is, and regardless in terms of what we inject in what we would like it to be. So perhaps sometimes once you've passed as a performer the hurdles of the exams, and you don't have to be hoping that you'll go to the next step after you hope to have convinced a diverse panel of judges into something probably they don't agree among themselves, like everybody, of course, at a certain age comes up in a doctoral way to say this is how it's supposed to be. And that's fine, because students need answers, and then you cannot always answer with a question, but it takes longer, and perhaps it's more enriching to find your own answer after you were questioned by the teacher to reach to that point, but given clues, given solutions, given articulation, given ornamentation, and the freedom of choosing them as well as the freedom of respecting them. It's not opposite. It's not at all opposite. As a matter of fact, it's probably the synthesis of these two elements of respect and freedom that will result in a performance that will be convincing, and for the performer and for the audience, even if they don't agree, but they'll be convinced. And I think this is the superior quality of rhetoric, is to be convincing by your own conviction, even if you can change mind later, but on the spot to organize that, not only knowledgeably, but also, and also, of course, group of 4 bars and group of 4 8 bars, but you have to also do it in systematic research of your own drive into it. If not, why would you spend all these hours trying to figure it out if you didn't love it in the first place? If it doesn't move you when you play it? I know it sounds very unprofessional to talk about that instead of the metronome and the practicing. But also, the soul and the brain Thank you.